Cheryl and I had been together for 10 years, and we were married 2 years ago. A month ago, we moved into our dream home in the small inland town of Waycross, Georgia, a charming property on a quiet street with a large yard and a patch of woods just behind it. We envisioned kids playing in the yard and a dog chasing them around. But dreams can turn into nightmares. The first weekend was idyllic. We spent our days unpacking and envisioning our future. Monday night, however, brought with it something sinister. Around midnight, just as we were settling into bed, the silence was broken by distant, haunting music. Cheryl and I froze. The sound wasn't from a neighbor's house. It was coming from our backyard. The tune was scratchy and vintage, like something playing on an ancient record player. As I strained to hear, I recognized it. Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf by Henry Hall. It was unnerving, the cheerful tone taking on a macabre edge as it drifted through the night air. I went downstairs to investigate, flipping on the backyard lights. The music wasn't coming from the yard, but from the woods beyond. I stepped out onto the lawn, trying to locate the source. Suddenly, the music stopped. The abrupt silence was suffocating. Tuesday night, it happened again. This time, the eerie tune was "Tiptoe Through the Tulips." Cheryl's face went pale. I could feel her fear, a reflection of my own. From the bedroom window, I saw something glinting in the grass. Against Cheryl's protests, I ventured outside. The source of the music was an old, rusted radio. I picked it up, my heart racing, when Cheryl screamed from the window, "Run! There's someone behind you!" I whipped around and saw 3 shadowy figures emerging from the tree line, their silhouettes barely illuminated by the moonlight. They stood unnaturally still, their heads slightly tilted as if studying me. Panic took over, and I sprinted back to the house, slamming the door shut behind me. The police came, but they didn't find anyone. They took the radio for evidence, but their search of the woods was brief, almost perfunctory. Cheryl and I spent the next week on edge, triple-checking locks and sleeping with lights on. Though the music hasn't returned, the woods feel darker, heavier, like they're watching us, waiting. Of hearing my insomniac father wandering the halls at night. One evening, I was startled awake by a familiar sound, footsteps on the stairs. My half-asleep brain immediately thought, Dad's at it again. But then I remembered, this wasn't my parents' house. The realization jolted me upright. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence was deafening. My pulse quickened as I called out, "Dad?" No response. I crept out into the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. Flicking on the light, I cautiously moved toward the staircase. At the bottom of the stairs stood a tall man in a mask. His blank, expressionless face stared up at me, frozen in place. I yelled, "Get out of my house!" My voice cracked, but the man didn't move. He simply tilted his head, as if mocking me. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out the front door. I locked the door behind him, trembling, and reached for my phone to call the police. That's when I heard the back door slam. There was a second intruder. Panic set in. I ran to the kitchen to grab a knife, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The police arrived minutes later, but it felt like an eternity. They found signs of forced entry at the kitchen window, but the intruders were long gone. For weeks, I barely slept. Every creak of the house set me on edge. I installed security cameras, but the footage only deepened my paranoia. Sometimes late at night, I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving outside, too tall to be the trees. When I bought my waterfront home, I thought I'd found paradise, a serene canal, perfect for boating. But the house across the canal made me uneasy from the start. It was old and dilapidated, its its windows perpetually dark. For weeks, I assumed it was unoccupied. Then one night, as I closed my blinds, I noticed a single light glowing in the house. A man stood at the window, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't move, just stood there, staring out into the darkness. The next day, I was planting grass seed in my backyard when I felt the prickling sensation of being watched. I turned and saw the same man, now standing in his backyard, staring directly at me. His gaze was unwavering, unnerving. I tried to ignore it, but his presence became a constant. At night, I'd see him at his window. During the day, he'd linger by the canal, watching me from across the water. One evening, as I drifted off to sleep, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps on my deck. I crept to the window, heart pounding, and saw a figure standing by my boat. Grabbing a flashlight, I shone it through the window. The man from across the canal stood there, his face pale and hollow, his eyes gleaming like a predator's. Behind him, I noticed movement. Another figure, crouched low, creeping toward my back door. I slammed my bedroom door and called the police, barricading myself in the room. The officers arrived and found muddy footprints leading from my deck to the canal, but the men were gone. The next day, my boat was gone too. The police claimed it was likely stolen by the same men, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't taken it to sell. They'd taken it to lure me to the water, to finish what they'd started. Now, every night, I close my blinds and lock my doors, but I still feel their eyes watching from across the canal.